When you need mealtime inspiration, it's worth shopping Kroger for thousands of appetizing ingredients that inspire countless mouth-watering meals. And no matter what tasty choice you make, you'll enjoy our everyday low prices. Plus, extra ways to save, like digital coupons worth over $600 each week and up to $1 off per gallon at the pump with points. So you can get big flavors and big savings. Kroger, fresh for everyone. Fuel restrictions apply.
By the time you're finished listening to this Pepsi Zero Sugar, you'll be 15 seconds closer to kickoff. Stock up now. Bengals game day is so close, you can almost taste it. Bengals watching. Better with Pepsi.
Hey everyone, Ray here. Many of you will be familiar with the #1 London Sunday Times bestselling author and award-winning historian Damien Lewis, whose many books cover the heroic exploits of Britain's elite SAS Special Forces unit, including his bestseller, The Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, recently turned into a feature film. Lewis has a new World War II nonfiction narrative, Forged in Hell, the gripping true story of the Special Forces heroes who broke the Nazi stranglehold. Lewis was provided with access to the SAS War Diary, a massive leather-bound volume that SAS leader Lieutenant Colonel Blair Paddy Mayne purloined from Schwerin, Germany, during World War II. It was transformed into a diary-cum-scrapbook embodying the SAS's wartime history. For Lewis, this was a veritable treasure trove of never-before-accessed wartime information that provided a framework for the book. A note for all you podcast listeners and armchair historians, Lewis encourages you to please contact him directly through his website with any new research, uncovered documents, or contributions that you feel may be of value. Forged in Hell from Kensington Publishing is available everywhere books are sold. Learn more at damienlewis.com. Hello, and thank you for listening to The History of World War II podcast, episode 493, The Rzhev Meat Grinder. Last time, Stalin, naively thinking that the Germans had exhausted themselves, ordered a counterattack in early December 1941. And given the cold, the lack of German supplies, and the proximity to Moscow, i.e. short supply lines for the Russians, this counterattack worked, more or less. Moscow was saved, but saving Mother Russia completely, that was still a long ways off. Which is why Stalin, no military genius, ordered counterattacks up and down the entire line. That his men were not ready, nor the country ready to feed these attacks with men and supplies, Stalin did not want to hear. So he did not. The attacks went forward. Important to Stalin, now that Moscow was out of immediate danger, was the great city of Leningrad, named after Soviet Russia's founder. But Stalin wasn't limiting himself to just Leningrad. No, as covered last time, the Kursk-Obayan operation, far south of Kaluga, launched in early January 1942, was to liberate both those cities. This failed, but it checked the Germans while also exhausting the Great Russian counterattack. Next, even further south, came the Barvenkovo-Lozovaya offensive operation, again covered last time, and this too would be a Soviet failure. But at first, it did make gains. Yet it would end with a Soviet salient that Moscow was not ready to hold or defend. In the coming months, this salient would be wiped out with another 300,000 Soviet troops. Which takes us back north to Leningrad, or rather, just south of it. The Battle of Volkhov River would see massive amounts of Soviet troops trying to weaken the southern perimeter around Leningrad, contrasted with Hitler's attempt to cut the last remaining rail line feeding, if that's the word, Leningrad. This attack, like all the others, would fail, but resulted in more German dead and a mutual halt to both sides' ability to push further into enemy territory. And yet, the Volkhov River operation was only the right wing of a larger pincer movement by Moscow. The left wing of several Soviet armies would also attempt to bypass Strauss's Ninth Army and cut off any retreat there. To destroy the northern end of Army Group Center would mean Army Group North would have no reinforcements, and if that could be achieved, then a renewed push towards Leningrad could be made. But any and every battle is not unlike opening Pandora's box. Once the fighting starts, there is no telling how the fortunes of war will turn, and that's what would happen here. In fact, the fighting around Rzhev, near the left flank of Army Group Center, mostly forgotten by Western historians, would come to symbolize the absolute carnage of the Eastern Front. It was a long, drawn-out battle, hard to pin down, but for the Germans, it represented a possible starting point to, once again, charge towards Moscow. It meant the same thing for the Russians, thus it became a priority. So it will come as no surprise that the fighting here would be titanic, as would its losses. Besides the hundreds of thousands of lives lost here, the struggle, which lasted for over a year, would become known as the Rzhev meat grinder. On a side note, before going deep into the fighting around Rzhev, there were other counterattacks ordered by Stalin at this time, like the landings of Soviet troops to the far south at Kerch and Feodosia on the eastern end of the Crimea. Before December 1942 was out, there would be some 85,000 Soviet troops and 43 light tanks landed there to retake the massive peninsula, though its liberation was still years away. And now, the Rzhev meat grinder. Rzhev is located on one of the main roads that goes to Moscow. It starts at Riga, Latvia, so when leaving Moscow, it goes to the west-northwest. Located only 144 miles, or 231 kilometers from Moscow, Rzhev was captured by Army Group Center as the capital itself came under direct German threat. So, when Hitler ordered a fallback on January 15, 1942, to a line that Rzhev was on near the northern end of Army Group Center's territory, this did not satisfy Stalin. Though it has to be said, the order to retreat there did not satisfy Hitler either, but it certainly had Stalin's attention now. The coming counterattack would see the far German left of Army Group Center bend back on itself in trying not to break, and as happened so many times, a salient would be created. But this one was odd. It didn't stick out to the east or west, but rather to the north. Still, a salient is a salient, hard to defend, and Moscow assumed it would either collapse or the Germans would pull back again to save its men within this salient. But that was not the case. Though not planned, this salient would come to represent so much more than just establishing dominance. It would become its own hell within a larger hell that was the Eastern Front. Specifically, as time went by, it would be Berlin wanting to hold the line here to prevent quick Soviet thrusts that would take Army Group Center even further away from Moscow. Well, what was left of it? Army Group Center, I mean. General Adolf Strauss's Ninth Army, on the left end of Army Group Center, suffered from the Soviet counterattack started on December 5th, just like everyone else. What almost broke Ninth Army, despite Soviet mid-level officers not having enough experience to finish what they started, was that Stalin had given General Ivan Konev, Strauss's opposite, 3 of his 5 reserve armies that had been building up just east of Moscow for all of November. So when Konev's Kalinin front moved out, all 3 reserve armies may not have been yet on the line, but they were rushing there. Thus, as December progressed, the pressure that Strauss's men felt only increased, which meant that Strauss's men were never fully far from collapsing for all of December. To save Army Group Center's left flank, Kluge begged Hitler for permission to fall back, and while fighting that fight, Kluge was also all but shouting to General George Hans Reinhardt, commander of the 3rd Panzer Army, to send his reserves to Strauss. When Reinhardt only sent a single battalion and a few tanks, Kluge switched tactics. Instead of ordering Reinhardt again, thus wasting time, Kluge pointed out that if Ninth Army did collapse, then Reinhardt's supplies would surely be cut by the enemy, as there would be no one to stop them. When the German 6th Corps, a part of Ninth Army, was pushed back across the Volga River in late December, running through Staritsa, it looked as if Strauss's men were about to lose everything, for their very equipment was slowing them down. But there at Staritsa, fortunately, 3 ice bridges had already been set up across the Volga, namely paths of ice, reinforced by German engineers. And these ice roads were enough to allow heavy equipment to be brought across. Well, most of it. Problem was, elements of the Red Army were right behind them. A feature that will become important later is that the Volga River in this area has the shape of a rather lazy V. It runs through Staritsa, then heads southwest, but then has an upturn, enough for it to then also run through Rzhev, about 25 miles or 40 kilometers southwest of Staritsa. Hence, for the Germans, the same river would twice be an impediment.
Ryan Reynolds here for, I guess, my 100th Mint commercial. No, don't. I mean, honestly, when I started this, I thought I only have to do like 4 of these. I mean, it's unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month. How are there still people paying 2 or 3 times that much? I'm sorry, I shouldn't be victim blaming here. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/save. Whenever you're ready.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
With the Russians on the tail of the retreating Germans, it's no surprise then that the German 6th Infantry Division around Staritsa was entangled with enemy troops. The Soviets had quickly established a small bridgehead over the Volga when chasing the enemy, while the German 6th tried to destroy it. Problem was, the German battalions, normally around 600 men each, were now down to 100 men each, and many of those were wounded, but they were certainly exhausted and frozen. By January 1st, 1942, more men from those 3 Soviet reserve armies had arrived, so attacks around Staritsa resumed. This was too much for the German 6th Infantry Division, so they, along with 3 other divisions, backed up again, and soon were on the road to the southwest that connects Staritsa with Rzhev. And here, a lack of Soviet fighting experience showed itself. Had Konev or whatever local commander held more men in reserve, once the Germans were backing up, they could have hounded them mercilessly. As it was, the only mobile unit the Soviets had opposite the German 6th Infantry was a Soviet cavalry battalion. Still, this unit managed to stay close to the retreaters and temporarily captured a village along the road. But they were eventually driven off, and the Germans set up another defensive line at the village of Koledino, less than half of the way from Staritsa to Rzhev. This new line was a part of the Königsberg Line, which had first been proposed by von Bock, Army Group Center's commander, back on December 9th. As this was suggested just days after Stalin's initial counterattack, and the Germans did not know yet what was coming at them, it's more likely that von Bock was thinking of his men's current supply problems versus the hordes of Russian men about to descend on them. The Königsberg Line went from the Volga, north of Rzhev, then went south through Gazaks, then Medin, then Orel, and finally Kursk. But, as we have seen, Hitler would not countenance this retreat. First, there were no or few fortifications along this line, and 2, the panzers did not have enough fuel to get there in one go. But also, as we have seen, Kluge knew this was where Army Group Center would eventually end up, so he had the men pull back in stages, all the while presenting his case over and over to Hitler. When the remainder of the 6th Infantry Division reached this line on January 2nd, where they had retreated from Staritsa, they were then hit with reality, not unlike a bullet to the chest. Somehow, probably desperation, rumors had been floating around that the Königsberg Line was a paradise of fortifications and housing, as if that somehow would have been possible. No, the survivors of 6th Infantry were now standing in the snow again, as they had before, along some arbitrary line. There was nothing that was going to change that, but as for reinforcements, those were closer to hand than imagined. For example, as the 3rd Battalion, 18th Infantry Regiment was down to 1 officer, 4 non-commissioned officers, and 20 men, the division's artillery crews, signals battalion, and supply columns were stripped of men and put onto the front line. This was fortuitous as the next day, January 3rd, the Soviets attacked again. The German 6th Infantry was guarding a section about 17 kilometers or 10 miles long, but next to them and the rest of the 6th Corps was the 23rd Corps, and here the Soviets smashed through. Soon the very road the Germans would need to reach Rzhev was threatened, as was the town itself. The desperate Germans counterattacked and managed to secure the road and close the gap. Again, the Soviets, going all out, had forgotten to keep some fresh men in reserve to exploit the coming opening, thus allowed themselves to be pushed back. But hell wouldn't be hell if there weren't other sufferings to offer. On January 10th, 6th Infantry Division was hit for the first time with Kayushka rocket launchers. These were multiple self-propelled artillery, normally on the backs of trucks, and could deliver intensity, if not accuracy. But if the enemy is lined up and deep, accuracy is not required. These weapons would improve in time, but for now, the Russians simply pointed them and fired, and each time an attack would follow. But because the Soviets were just as tired as the Germans, it came to little, besides more death. Had the Russians rested for a few days, built up their forces, keeping some for further exploitation, the history of Army Group Center could have been very different, or rather, much worse. But they did not. They simply attacked in this manner for several weeks. And though far from perfect, this imperfect Russian attack allowed the Germans to build up a battle group and plug it into the breach between the 6th and 23rd Corps. But plugging the hole, that wasn't enough. There was to be another counterattack. This made-up-on-the-spot battle group would push north when word was given, but also hitting the same enemy section from the west would be a cavalry brigade, an SS cavalry brigade. As this was an SS unit, there was actually very little military training. Most of these men that were brought in who joined the regiment were simply brought in to kill or wipe out villages after the real resistance had ended. So it will come as no surprise that these SS cavalrymen were easily beaten back, which ruined the localized German counterattack. But as there had been heavy losses for the horsemen, this meant that 6th Infantry Division, more in name than reality, had to move back again. They didn't go far, but managed to close the line, and with that done, got to work making real fortifications, not hoped-for ones. This part of the line would stay in place until the summer. Not that the fighting here was over.
This episode is brought to you by United Airlines. When you want to make the most of your vacation, book with United. They're an airline that cares about your travels as much as you do. United is transforming the flying experience with Bluetooth connectivity, screens, power at every seat, and bigger overhead bins to help fit everyone's bag. And with their app, you can skip the bag check line, get live updates, and more. Change the way you fly. Book your next trip today at united.com.
A bit south of the 6th Infantry, the 19th Panzer Division, now a part of 40th Corps, was down to 6 tanks. But even their status was semi-operational. Why? Because their turrets were frozen in place. As for the majority of the tank crewmen, they were now infantry. Problem was, their black uniforms made them easy targets in the snow. Point is, as bad as things were for Army Group Center, the new line was beginning to firm up. It certainly was north of Rzhev. Not that it mattered, because Stalin, he was about to launch the mother of all offensives, something that would make the entire world shake. On January 5th, 1942, Stalin met with the Stavka, and though the Supreme Commander would ask for opinions, his was the only one that mattered, and he had already decided their next course. The meeting would open up with General Chief of Staff of the Red Army, Boris Shaposhnikov, giving an update on all of the fronts of the Eastern War. Then Stalin spoke. He told this room of uniformed men that the Germans were still reeling from being pushed back from Moscow, but they would bide their time and come back in the spring. Now was the time to attack them, to get them to commit their reserves before the spring. And then, possibly making a dark joke, he said, "We have new reserves. The Germans have none." And the plan he laid out next for every Soviet front was not unlike God creating the universe in 6 days. But here, Stalin's forces would be unmaking all enemy forces on Soviet territory. As his men sat stunned, the Soviet premier continued. The main attack would be carried out by the left wing of the Northwest Front, relative to Moscow, along with the Kalinin Front, the Western Front, which is in front of Moscow, and the Bryansk Front, which is southwest of Moscow. All these forces would work together to encircle the enemy troops in the Rzhev, Vyazma, Smolensk region, thus ensuring its destruction. Also, the Leningrad and Volkhov Front, along with the right wing of the Northwest Front, with help from the Baltic Fleet, would annihilate Army Group North and relieve Leningrad. To the south, the Southwestern and Southern Fronts would together attack and destroy Army Group South, freeing the Donbass region, leaving the Caucasus Front and the Black Sea Fleet to retake the Crimea. And to top it off, this would start in a few days. Then Stalin invited those around him to speak, but liking their livelihoods and their lives, most stayed quiet. Most, but not Zhukov. Zhukov, in charge of the Western Front, the area just west of Moscow, gave his thoughts, but was more guarded and respectful of the Germans' ability. He started out by saying, in the western direction, we have created favorable conditions, but that's it. But all of our forces here and elsewhere need more men, more supplies, and we should limit our objectives to our current abilities, based on our resources and the ability of our men, who were still learning. More than anything, we need tanks. He continued, as for Leningrad, those Soviet troops face more organized and less shattered enemy troops. The key there is artillery. If not, we will attack and lose many men, only to have to start the process of recruiting and training all over again, losing time, the one thing that we all agree we cannot give to the enemy. And because the enemy is still only 42 miles or 70 kilometers from Moscow, the priority should be the Western Front, to drive them further away from the capital. The room then got quiet. Suddenly, one man spoke up, Nikolai Alexeyevich, the first deputy chairman of the Council of People's Commissars. He supported Zhukov and basically said, we do not yet have the resources for a simultaneous offensive on all fronts. To Zhukov's insightful evaluation, Stalin only had one reply. He said that Timoshenko, commander of the Southwestern Front, agreed with Stalin, and somehow that was that. Zhukov read his leader's mind, having worked with him for some time. To Stalin's thinking, the Germans were beat, that Russia only had to keep on attacking them to beat the Germans and win the war. Ironically, Hitler was of the same mind, just in reverse. The Russians were spent. Yes, they had made gains, but they were now exhausted, and somehow, though his men were also exhausted and without the means to fight effectively or survive the winter, all they had to do was re-engage with the Russians, and they would win, all the way back to Moscow. But Zhukov knew, as did many of the men in this room, of the cost of their recent victories. Hundreds of thousands of newly dead men had to be replaced, plus even more reinforcements recruited with the proper equipment, including weapons, food, and winter clothing, before such an undertaking could succeed. Yet again, Zhukov knew his Stalin. The leader, calmly walking around the room as he spoke, was thinking of the recent victories at Tikhvin that had reopened that one rail line to Leningrad, of the fact that the enemy had been driven away from Rostov to the south, though that was only possible as the Germans, i.e. Hitler, had overreached himself. Zhukov's final thought must have been, but the decision has already been made, even before this meeting started. And he was right. 2 days later, orders were sent out for all of these attacks by the Stavka. Zhukov's right flank of 3 armies was to push on to Rzhev, while the Kalinin front, just above Zhukov, was to also drive on Rzhev. The rest of Zhukov's western front would make for Mozhaevsk, due west of Moscow, with 2 other armies. And just below this, 3 more armies would make for Vyazma, just over 100 miles southwest of Mozhaevsk. After the German forces around Vyazma were worn down, a reinforced cavalry corps would finish the drive to Vyazma. Then the forces further north would meet up with the southern armies of the Western Front and complete a massive encirclement of Army Group Center. Meanwhile, Leningrad would be liberated, and to the south, Orel, Kursk, and Kharkov would be recaptured. But it has to be said, this level, this scale of coordinated attacks was beyond Soviet forces in early 1942, which did not even take into account supplies, certainly since the orders were expected to be executed in a matter of days. But showing that something had been learned, Stalin ensured that the orders also included how the initial fighting would play out. The Soviet armies would not attack along a broad front. No, they would pick a point and focus there like a wedge, but they would start with a highly coordinated artillery attack. Forget that enough artillery units weren't even available at this time, even more so supplies. It was somehow to just be figured out. Had he been given his way, Zhukov would have used all of the reserve armies to focus solely on Army Group Center. Its destruction, or at least its being driven back, would doom Hitler's war in the East. With Army Group Center gutted, there would have been no way the 2 other army groups could have supported each other. Thus, they could have been taken out or pushed back piecemeal. But Zhukov was not in charge. Stalin was. This massive attack would go forward. But Stalin was right in one regard. The Germans would not have time to ready themselves for such a fight. Then again, neither would the Russians. Greetings, everyone, from Central Virginia. Ray here. I hope the holiday spirit is either upon you or soon will be. Christmas is hit here full time. It's complicated. Don't worry about it. Anyway, so I'd like to say thank you to some people. Let's see here. I have a new member, Azra Bogovich. Thank you very much. And as far as donations, let's see here. Aurelion Schuss. I hope I got that right. Let's see here. Matthew Werner. Sorry, I was reading it like it was German. I apologize for that, Matthew. Matthew is my new best friend. Thank you very much, Matthew, for your donation. Let's see here. Leo Brown, Chad Reinhardt, Nick Justo, Anthony DeLuca, and Stephen Mullett from Australia. So thank you very much. And on a final note, Nick Nairhood and Karen R., we got their membership stuff straightened out. So hopefully they're listening to the over 200 episodes of membership episodes, keeping them busy while I come out with another episode. So we are we're about to firmly be into 1942. We'll see how it goes and watch Stalin again bite off more than he can chew, but still damage is done to the German forces, and so I think he'd be okay with that. So sorry about missing last week, but life got in the way. Take care, everyone.
Hey, history fans, if you enjoy listening to podcasts like The History of World War II, then you'll love Airwave History Plus, now available on Apple Podcasts. Airwave History Plus is your ticket to ad-free listening to the history of World War II, plus bonus content and early episodes from dozens of the most popular history podcasts, including History That Doesn't Suck, the Explorers Podcast, The History of the Great War, the American Revolution Podcast, The History of the Second World War, The Age of Napoleon, and more. To get your free 7-day trial, go to the Apple page for the History of World War II and hit subscribe, or search Airwave History Plus on Apple Podcasts. Airwave History Plus, the essential audio destination for history lovers. Hey, history fans, if you enjoy listening to podcasts like The History of World War II, then you'll love Airwave History Plus, now available on Apple Podcasts. Airwave History Plus is your ticket to ad-free listening to the history of World War II, plus bonus content and early episodes from dozens of the most popular history podcasts, including History That Doesn't Suck, the Explorers Podcast, the History of the Great War, the American Revolution Podcast, the History of the Second World War, the Age of Napoleon, and more. To get your free 7-day trial, go to the Apple page for the History of World War II and hit subscribe, or search Airwave History Plus on Apple Podcasts. Airwave History Plus, the essential audio destination for history lovers.